Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Now, Surrey Mayor Brenda Locke is not backing down on the policing issue. We'll hear what she had to say at a news conference this morning. And the federal government is promising to do more on the housing crisis, including billions toward rental and affordable housing and measures on short-term rentals. The changes reportedly will come in tomorrow's fiscal update. There has been a repeated call from advocates for the government to step up. And so we're asking, what is the federal government's role on affordable housing? What do you want to hear from Ottawa? That's our topic this hour. I'm Michelle Eliot. Welcome to BC Today. Thanks for joining us on CBC Radio 1, live streaming on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Our first story now, there remains a lot of uncertainty around Surrey's policing issue and the future. Last week, Solicitor General Mike Farnworth announced the suspension of that city's police board and appointed an administrator to fulfill their functions. Well, today, Surrey Mayor Brenda Locke shot back. She says her city will fight the suspension and add a second court petition contesting the constitutionality of last week's decision.
We are taking a significant step to stop the NDP police service. As a result of the province's attempted police takeover, which would require double-digit NDP tax hike on Surrey taxpayers, we are challenging the constitutionality of the province's latest legislation. Surrey voters deserve to have their voices heard. We said the original estimates regarding the transition timelines and costs were completely unrealistic, and we were right. Before the municipal election, the province said choosing a police force was the city's decision. So my team and I ran on a platform that was clear. We would stop the police transition and keep the RCMP in Surrey. After the municipal election, the province said that we had the option to put forward a plan to keep the RCMP. It is now clear that the province had other plans in mind. This government does not have the right to run roughshod on every local government that doesn't bend to their will. When Surrey didn't agree with their costly plans, they hastily ordered us to move forward with a very expensive and disorganized transition. And when we had challenged their authority to do that, they rushed through legislation at a record pace to cover up the mistakes that they had made. Now, they have removed civilian oversight on policing and installed another police officer to carry out this expensive, disorganized transition.
Well, that is Surrey Mayor Brenda Locke speaking just this morning. We'll continue to follow that story for you. And now on to our open line. Well, tomorrow, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland will present the federal government's fall fiscal update. And CBC is reporting that will include billions of dollars in loans and direct funding for the construction of affordable housing. And that's according to a senior government source. CBC reports the new measures will include $15 billion for 10-year loans for new rental housing construction and a $1 billion fund for getting more nonprofit and public housing built. There had also been previous reports that the government will pursue new measures for short-term rentals to make them less lucrative for homeowners. We're asking you this hour, what do you want to hear from Ottawa on the issue of affordable housing? What role should the federal government play? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 on your cell phone, star or pound 690. You can email us to bctoday@cbc.ca. Well, question period is underway right now. We are watching it for you and we'll take you there live if housing is further debated. There was debate already on housing this past hour, and opposition leader, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre spoke about his expectations for tomorrow's fall fiscal update, and he raised concerns about rising interest rates.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's plan is to increase mortgage payments by 150%, which is already done. And now Scotiabank says government deficits have added 2 percentage points to interest rates. That works out to $700 a month, or $8,400 a year in higher mortgage payments linked directly to deficits, including the massive deficits by this government. A year ago, they promised a balanced budget. They broke the promise 6 months later. Will they come back tomorrow with a plan to balance the budget so we can bring down interest rates and inflation so that Canadians can keep their homes? Yes.
That's Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre speaking in the last hour. Well, ahead of tomorrow's fall fiscal statement and the expected funding in the billions of dollars toward rental and affordable housing, we are asking you, what do you want to hear from Ottawa? What role should the federal government play on the issue of affordable housing? Love to hear from you on the open line. 1-800-825-5950 is our toll-free number. Locally in Metro Vancouver, it's 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. By email, you can reach us at bctoday@cbc.ca. And joining me here in our studio is Craig Jones, Associate Director of UBC's Housing Research Collaborative and the Housing Assessment Resource Tools. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I know I caught you in the middle of a housing conference, in fact. Is that right?
Yeah, this week is BC's largest affordable housing conference, Housing Central.
So obviously an ongoing issue. When it comes to the federal government, perhaps you can take us back and just outline for us what historically has been the role for the federal government on rental and affordable housing.
Yeah, so before World War II, so I'm going back a ways, there wasn't really that much of a role that the federal government played in housing. There actually wasn't all that much government policy on housing. But after once World War II had finished, there were there was a lot of veterans that were returning home. Mm-hmm. There had been a lack of housing production during the war, and so there was a real need to expand the supply of housing, and so that was a key role that the federal government played at that time to spur that. And then moving forward, the federal government continued to play a leading role in federal housing policy. It also was, through the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, it was a real center of housing expertise for the country. That's really where the housing experts were located. So that's there's a long history. I could talk about when that all changed.
Yes, please, because I think that's where a lot of the comments that we hear from callers and advocates is that, the federal government has gotten out of building purpose-built rentals. So the CMHC was instrumental in that. And when did that all change then, and why?
So
I'm asking you a lot here. I can tell.
Yeah. So it depends on what kind of hat you want me to put on, whether you want me to put my academic hat or the policy. Things really started to change in the late 1980s, and especially in the early 1990s. So housing policy is expensive. Building housing is costly, and a lot of the non-market housing that was built was done through borrowing. The government, borrowed money in order to roll out a lot of this housing. And then when interest rates went up, during the 1980s, they went up significantly. That made the carrying cost of those obligations at the federal level extremely expensive. And so there was also I'll just use the term neoliberalism kind of arrived in Canada in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And that idea brought with it a need to balance federal budgets. Federal budgets balance, and because housing policy is so expensive, there were already so many ongoing obligations that in the early 1990s, the federal government basically got out of any new provision of social housing in Canada. And there's also the reality that funding for housing is in competition with funding for education and healthcare, which are obviously provide direct and obvious benefits. Funding for education creates jobs. It strengthens the future of the economy. Obviously, funding for healthcare.
It's a lot
creates
to
jobs.
balance.
It does, and so housing does not show housing expenses, and it doesn't show those same immediate benefits.
Okay. And so, you track as well at UBC the need for things like rental housing. So to what extent has that, the federal government not being involved in building these units, to what extent has that contributed to what we see now, which is a lack of units and increased rents?
Yeah, so I would say it's not entirely accurate to say that the CMHC is a direct builder of rental housing. It's a supporter of rental housing, but especially social and cooperative housing. Whereas rental housing traditionally, the rental housing construction in Canada had its heyday in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s. That's when we
Right.
saw a lot of purpose-built rental
Right.
developed. And so there were tax incentives in place during that whole time. We didn't yet have condominium legislation. So back previously, we either had rental apartments or single family homes. There was kind of this dichotomy, and condominium legislation really changed that and made investment in condos more attractive. And so what we see in the historical data is that we across Canada for a period of time. There's a lot of purposeful rental housing that gets built, and by purposeful, I mean that's one sort of single owner landlord of a building and a bunch of apartments in there. And then for a variety of reasons, that production of purposeful rental just drops off completely and stays that way, stays very low in terms of production until recently, actually. So within the last 8 to 10 years, in many places across the country, we are seeing a return to seeing new purposeful rental get built.
Okay. And so what now? What do you make of now? You talked about tax incentives. The government has talked about GST breaks, and now reportedly these loans for new rental housing construction. What difference do you think that will make then?
It's hard to say exactly what difference that will make given the high interest rate environment. I know that I've heard repeatedly that higher interest rates make it really hard to make rental projects pencil out, given that the return on investment for a rental building, the horizon is a lot longer, so they're a lot more sensitive to higher interest rates. The GST exemption has been something that the rental sector has been calling for many years, and so I think that does make sense to me to see that as something that applies to all projects. Whereas before it was that there would be programs that builders could apply for and then receive a rebate of sorts from the feds. Now just all project applies to all projects, so it could help.
Thank you very much for this. I find it very useful, and I feel like you've given us a history too. I can imagine what I see around Vancouver, right? The purpose-built rental buildings that I see from the 70s and 80s, and then the condo towers that were, of course, became ubiquitous in the 90s and 2000s. And so you've laid out the policy behind all of that. My guest is Craig Jones from UBC, and we are asking you, in light of tomorrow's announcements, the fall economic update from the federal government, what do you want to hear when it comes to housing? What should be the federal government's role, do you think, in addressing the issue of affordable housing? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone as well. And by email, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. My guest, Craig Jones, Associate Director of UBC's Housing Research Collaborative and the Housing Assessment Resource Tools. Let's get to Eva, who's joining us from Surrey. What are your expectations? What do you hope to hear from Ottawa on housing, Eva?
Yes, I would like to see the federal government, just look at every municipality and look at all the towers that are being built right now. Just buy a few of them up. You could offset the cost with the lands you're planning to sell anyway, and then you have an immediate supply of housing right away. Change those towers that the government buys into rental housing, maybe a couple of floors for services. They're in the midst of being built right now all over in Surrey. I can see from where I live. I'm a renter as well. They're everywhere. So why are we waiting for them to sell property plan this, plan that. Just do it.
And Eva, the towers that you see in Surrey, are they private developers or are they owned by, who owns them? Do you know?
Oh, they're all private developers.
Yeah. So, I'm just trying to get to what your suggestion is, that the federal government step in and purchase these then. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they're already in the throes of being built or finished being built just now.
Right.
I mean, just a block away from me, they just opened up another one. But again, they're all the kind that you have to purchase because the signs are out, for sale and so, and these are impossible for the regular person to buy.
Sure. And Eva, for yourself, you're a renter.
Yes.
What has it been like for you?
Well, it's expensive. I'm a senior. I'm on a limited income, but lucky for me, I have a pretty good pension, but still it's quite tall. I think my income is more than the 33% that they suggest. It's pretty pricey.
It eats up more than 33% of your income.
Yes.
In terms of so that would be considered unaffordable, right? In terms of how
Yeah,
we measure
and I'm in the heart of Surrey,
You're in the heart.
Central.
And a lot of people moving there too.
Yeah.
Eva, thank you so much. I really appreciate hearing from you.
You're welcome.
Take care. That's Eva in Surrey, and I'll get some comment on her suggestion there as well in a second. But Robert has been waiting in Vancouver. And Robert, what do you want to hear from the federal government on housing?
Yes, thanks for taking my call. It's not so much like I'm waiting to hear anything from them. I just have a question for your guest that's very related to what your topic is. I'm just wondering, once these places are all built, what's to prevent the real estate investment trusts and hedge funds from buying everything up? Because, number one, they're already doing that in the States and Canada. And number two, they have a lot of private capital, and private capital can borrow money at a way lower rate from the banks than I can. So is there going to be some stipulation that prevents them from doing this?
Okay, that's a great question, Robert. And I just want to ask you personally, how has the housing issue affected you?
It hasn't affected me. I was fortunate to some degree because a bit of money passed through my family for a few generations, and I was able to actually buy a condo in Vancouver around 2010. So I'm okay, but I get into my car every day in the alleyway. I park out back, and I give all my change to these people that are going through bins and homeless and everything because it just breaks my heart.
Really good to hear from you, Robert. Thank you so much. Thanks for the question.
Okay.
Let's put that to Craig Jones then. The possibility of investors snapping up these units that are going to be built.
Yeah, there is a growing concern amongst housing research across Canada, what is called the financialization of housing, the movement of investors like real estate investment trusts seeking to generate a return. Some people would say, well, housing has always been a financial vehicle, and so what is different about this? But yeah, there definitely is a heightened concern that this could drive up housing costs. What I have heard on that front is that, and this actually relates to the previous question, at the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project, we advocate for the use of vacant or underutilized public land as an input for new housing production, for nonprofit housing production. So we advocate for that.
Okay.
And we work to map where that land is located, and so we're strong advocates of that. On the other side, it's been observed now that rental affordability, sort of existing market affordability, is being eroded over time across Canada. So non-subsidized rents are going up across the country, and so we're seeing a loss of units that would be deemed quite affordable. Usually, the benchmark is either less than $750 or less than $1,000 a month, and we're seeing hundreds of thousands of units like that, disappearing over a 10-year period. And for every unit of social housing that's built, it's sort of like the ratio is like 1 new unit of social housing versus like 4 to 11 existing market units. So what we advocate for is the acquisition of existing rental buildings that are a bit older, that are renting at what are already deemed relatively affordable levels, and to then move that into either non-market housing or to preserve it through a community land trust.
And that's partly what the province has been doing, right?
Absolutely, through the Rental Protection Fund,
Right.
yeah. And I'll also note that what I've heard is that there are real estate investment trusts that are actually quite keen on the idea of an acquisition fund in BC.
I guess the question would that be, aren't you just replacing existing rentals already? You're not really creating net new
Yeah,
things, right?
and that's actually a response that we have had back from CMHC, certain parties of CMHC, is that by acquiring existing buildings, we're not adding to the stock, but it's kind of like putting water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. You know, it's draining out the bottom as we pour it on top. What we pour in, we've got way more coming out the bottom. So the net effect. Also, research conducted by our team found that the acquisition of existing buildings over the long term can be about 25% more cost effective than building new affordable housing.
Okay, all right. Craig Jones is here with me, Associate Director of UBC's Housing Research Collaborative and the Housing Assessment Resource Tools. We're asking you, what role do you think the federal government needs to play on the issue of affordable housing? We're talking about that this full hour here on BC Today. Love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Email too is bctoday@cbc.ca. And Susan writes, new funding for co-op housing is what I would like to see from the federal government. I see Craig Jones nodding to that comment. Thank you very much, Susan. And Terry writes, I want all levels of government to know housing is the only issue that really matters to me and many Canadians. Get back into rental projects and tax breaks for purpose-built rental projects. Thanks as well to Terry. bctoday@cbc.ca is our email address. On the phone, Pat is joining us from the Sunshine Coast. Hello, Pat. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I've been noticing this trend towards Airbnbs a lot, especially since the house beside me sold a couple of years ago, and the person that bought it turned it into an Airbnb. And as you can appreciate, being a homeowner beside an Airbnb, you have no ability to sort of chat with the people who are renting about what they're doing. And during this water crisis that we've had, the people who are coming over, they don't really understand or care. And the same with the fire ban. What happened was 2 days after the fire ban was put on, an Airbnb person came in and started a fire. You know, like the campfire, because it was touted on their site. Oh, have a nice campfire under the stars.
So has there been, do you know if they have been penalized for,
Well, the thing is that, you know, we're a small community over here. I live in the SDRD. And the thing is that our fire people, we went up to the person and said, please take it out. We're in a fire ban. And they did. So, you know, we do care. And the neighbors are all on side with that. But to the bigger question is that we also need housing for workers. We need housing for our doctors, our nurses, our hospital staff, and it's eroding. And the thing is that it's nice to sort of see the BC government thinking of doing something, but the federal government has to do something. And the other part of it is, as a taxpayer, we're the people that are paying for these guys to make money. I mean, my tax dollars are going to building new housing. Yeah, that sounds really great at this, but it takes a few years to get it. But even so, these people are making money. Like this Airbnb rents out at $400 to $500 a night, and so there's no incentive for them to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that it's also against the bylaws. Well, we have 1.5 bylaw officer on the coast.
So it's
and
about
I've heard
enforcement.
Of different people that have actually, and I'm not talking about the ones who have an Airbnb in their home. They police the people that come. They have different rules.
Yeah.
And so, and I appreciate the fact in this climate that you need something to help pay for your home.
The point about short-term rentals, yes. And so under this proposal from the federal government, they would like to make it hard for owners of short-term rental properties to get tax deductions, so deduct rental expenses such as interest costs or property taxes or repairs. And so that would essentially make it less lucrative for short-term rental owners, and this would require some legislative changes as well. So that apparently is what's coming from the federal government, reportedly on the issue of short-term rentals. This is a very, very hot topic. What are your thoughts?
So David Walksmith is a professor at McGill University, and he has really, his whole focus of his work is on short-term rentals and Airbnb and the effect that they can have on housing markets. And so what he has found is that in areas where there are short-term rentals present, then sort of ongoing renters see a slightly higher cost to their rents. He found that. And he also found that the effect on the vacancy rate of short-term rentals can be about 1%. So when we take a look at, Vancouver, which has a vacancy rate that is sometimes below 1%, never is really as high as 3%, an increase in the vacancy rate by 1% is a pretty significant, could have a pretty significant impact. It's a hot topic. It's pretty complicated to say, whether or not this is an inherent good or bad thing.
And that research that you cited, that the researcher, it was his research the province used, right, in terms of making its announcement.
I wouldn't be surprised if it had a pretty significant influence. This has been his focus for years, and the work he's doing is really very rigorous. So these findings are highly reliable.
I can check on that then as well. Thank you so much. Really good to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That is Craig Jones, Associate Director of UBC's Housing Research Collaborative and the Housing Assessment Resource Tools. And we will have a live full network special tomorrow to follow the federal fall economic statement. That will be at 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern. And we'll continue to take your calls this hour as well, asking you, what role do you think the federal government needs to play on the issue of affordable housing? They are promising to tackle it in tomorrow's fall fiscal update. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. More of your calls coming up in our next half hour, right after the CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. The City of Surrey says recent changes to the Police Act forcing it to transition to a municipal police force are unconstitutional. Mayor Brenda Locke says the city is launching a Supreme Court challenge of the new legislation. Last week, the provincial government replaced the entire police board with an administrator. A group of workers in Kamloops are believed to be the first staff at a Canadian A&W to successfully unionize. 13 people who work at the Valley View location signed union cards and have been certified with the Labour Relations Board. And strong winds are slamming much of BC's central and north coast, causing power outages and potentially disrupting travel across those regions. Gusts are expected to reach up to 120 kilometers an hour. Forecasters say conditions should improve by tomorrow. And now taking a look at the forecast, the wind warnings are in place for Haida Gwaii, North Vancouver Island and the North Coast. Meanwhile, snowfall warnings cover most northern sections of the province. Elsewhere, highs to 1 and mainly cloudy in the Peace. In the central interior, mainly cloudy with a high of 4 degrees. Highs from -1 to +4 with a bit of sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 4 as well. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria and the Fraser Valley, some sun and cloud this afternoon with highs around 9 degrees. I'll have more local news at the top of the hour. Now back to Michelle with BC Today.
Thanks so much, Rob. That's Robert Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. Thanks for being with us here on BC Today. We are live on CBC Radio 1 across the province, live streaming too on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC. You can find us on YouTube. Just search for CBC Vancouver. And it is that time of year again, the beginning of the countdown to our annual CBC British Columbia Food Bank Day fundraiser. Friday, December the 1st, it will be our 37th annual event. Over these decades, you, our CBC audience, has donated over $18 million to support food banks around BC and, of course, their clients. Now, your donation will help people like this.
Hello, my name is Galina. I am from Ukraine. I am and my family, my husband and my son, we arrived in Canada 8 months ago because the war in Ukraine. And we use the food bank every week. This is big support for us. I am and my husband, we work in both, but we don't have enough money. We get that minimum salary. My husband work in the construction. I work in the warehouse, London Drugs. In Ukraine, I have so many jobs. I have experience 15 years. I work in the financial sector and warehouse too. My husband, he was a big boss in the mining company. I'm happy because first of all, my child in safe here, and I'm happy. If you have extra money, you can help people who are in difficult situation. This is helps them surviving.
Thank you, Galina, for sharing your story. And yes, Friday, December the 1st is our 37th annual CBC British Columbia Food Bank Day fundraiser. If you are able to make a donation, you can do so anytime at our secure online donation site. That's cbc.ca/foodbankday. There's a drop-down menu, and you can choose the food bank of your choice anywhere in BC. Within minutes of donating, you will receive an email with a tax receipt. Again, that is cbc.ca/foodbankday. And on December 1st, I will be sharing the stage with Margaret Gallagher, host of North by Northwest, for a special 3-hour edition of BC Today. And this year, you can listen to the program on CBC Radio. You can now also watch the live stream on CBC Gem or on our website, cbc.ca/BC. It is 12:37 now, 1:37 in the Mountain Time Zone. We are continuing our coverage of the expected federal housing announcement. Now, Tuesday's economic statement reportedly will focus on the creation of rental and affordable housing. CBC reports billions of dollars are said to be announced for housing construction in that fiscal update tomorrow. We're asking you this hour, what role do you think the federal government needs to play on the issue of affordable housing? Our phone numbers again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 or email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. My next guest is Carolina Ibarra. She's the CEO of Pacifica Housing, and they are a registered Canadian charity, one of Vancouver Island's largest providers of affordable homes. And Carolina joins me now. Good afternoon. Hi, Carolina. Can you hear me? We might have some trouble with our connection with Carolina Ibarra, CEO of Pacifica Housing. We'll try to fix that for you. My apologies. But right now, let's head to our phone lines. Rick is joining us from Victoria. Hi, Rick.
Hey, how you doing?
I am fine. Thanks so much for calling. Well, what do you think the Ottawa should do?
So I've got a few things to note, and then I'll finish off with what I think the government can do. So often people talk about supply and demand with the housing market, which is fair, but they ignore that demand includes investors. So the demand for people to actually want to buy these houses. So when there's not enough supply, it increases demand because investors can come in and take advantage of the ability to charge higher rents. So building more homes helps with the supply, but it doesn't help with demand unless you can have so many properties on the market that it really drives down the cost, and then investors decide to sell and invest elsewhere, which would mean popping of the bubble, essentially. Another thing to note is when looking at figures such as mortgages and defaulting on mortgages, et cetera, it's important to recognize the difference between a homeowner and a property owner. And politicians often talk about people losing their homes, but that often includes people losing their investment properties. So if a property owner has to sell one of their extra properties, they're not losing their home. They're actually allowing someone else to buy a home. And
might they be losing a source of income, I suppose?
Certainly. And don't get me wrong, landlords aren't the problem. They're just playing within the game. It's smart money. Like anyone that's read Rich Dad, Poor Dad 20 years ago knows that's where you make your money. But we have to affect their balance sheet to make it less lucrative to seek rent in housing and instead invest in productive businesses, businesses that contribute to the economy. So increasing interest rate is a blunt tool. I think a more precise tool would be to tax property owners that own more than one additional property that family doesn't live in. Stop corporations from buying single-family housing. Remove the capital gains tax break for the investing class. Selling your primary home would still be exempt from capital gains, but right now, like, capital gains tax break means that if you sell a property for $80,000 profit, only half of that is taxed. The other half is tax-free. But people that have to work for a living for that $80K are taxed on the full amount. And then the last thing they could do is look at if using the Smith maneuver for tax-exempt mortgage payments aligns with the goal of housing.
Rick, thank you very much. And did you want to end with what you want to hear from the federal government, or was that the point that you wanted to make?
Those four things.
Okay.
So tax property owners that own more than one additional property that family doesn't live in, stop corporations, remove the capital gains tax break, and look at the Smith maneuver.
Really interesting, Rick. And, you have followed up on the point that was made by an earlier caller who said, okay, so they're providing funding to build all these new buildings, but who's going to buy them? How can they ensure that this will go to affordable housing? Might it just go to investors yet again? So, Rick, good to hear from you. Thanks so much for the call.
Thank you.
That's Rick joining us from Victoria. And we now have Carolina Ibarra, CEO of Pacifica Housing. Hello there.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
Thanks for joining us. What would you like to hear as a nonprofit dealing with affordable housing? What would you like to hear from the federal government tomorrow?
What I would like to hear is funding allocated for delivering new units, and in particular for nonprofits, because I've heard your callers say how are they going to ensure that it's not just investors that get it, those units again. Well, nonprofits keep it in the community, and our missions are to keep things affordable. So I think I'd really like to see that. Another is that some of those dollars are also applied towards renewal of existing properties, because there's some that cannot be redeveloped, but really need a lot of work, especially in the nonprofit sector, so that we can keep affordable homes that are safe and secure for people. And lastly, but I don't think it's going to be in the announcement, is a bit more certainty on what's going to happen with homelessness prevention funding that's coming up in March. There's a lot of successful programs that have their funding coming up for renewal very shortly, and there's not a lot of certainty yet as to what is going to happen with them. And I guess if I was just going to add one more thing, is that this money gets out the door, because there's been some examples of success with CMHC being able to come to the table to push projects that are stalled to get them built. But a systemic problem for them has been just that the funding is so bureaucratic, it's really hard to get it out the door. And that money's only as good as the units that are built with it.
How long do you see this funding actually making a difference, and what kind of timeline might we be looking at?
Well, it could make an immediate difference on a number of projects. Just because interest rates have gone up so much, a number of projects have been stalled. I know the provincial government is coming to the table with some funding, and that will only go so far. So I think it would have an immediate impact. And then, further down the line for projects that are in the earlier stages, we're talking about units probably being delivered in 3 years. So, I mean, this money can't come fast enough for immediate impact and midterm impact.
Okay, let's take some more calls here. Carolina Ibarra joins me from Victoria, CEO of Pacifica Housing, and they are a registered Canadian charity, one of Vancouver Island's largest providers of affordable homes. We have been asking you what you want to hear from the federal government on affordable housing ahead of the fall economic update tomorrow. It will be delivered by Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. You can call us 1-800-825-5950. 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. By email, bctoday@cbc.ca. Dawn writes, I think the big question to ask the government is if they are going to relax building codes. Building requirements are the single biggest barrier to new housing, and no one wants to talk about it. That's an interesting point, Dawn. I wonder if that's something developers are talking about, and to what extent building requirements need to change. Thanks very much for that. Jeff wants to hear from the federal government that they should open up Crown land to residential housing. I work remotely and would gladly leave my rental unit to relocate. Jeff, thanks very much for sharing your story too. Jesse is on the line now from Courtney. Hi, Jesse. Welcome to the show.
Yes, hi. Excuse me. I just have one comment to make, and I don't know how this would work out financially for the government, but I think that they could make mortgage interest on residential properties tax deductible. It seems to me that that might help to balance out high interest rates. If you knew that in the end you could deduct the interest paid on your mortgage.
How have interest rates affected you, Jesse?
Well, they haven't. I'm turning 80 soon, and I'm renting right now. I sold my last property last year or earlier this year, but I never did have a mortgage. I didn't qualify for one, so I saved up my money until I could afford an inexpensive little house and didn't have those payments. It means that you know, instead of struggling to pay out, you struggle to save, and then you don't have the pressure of you know, trying to make a mortgage payment, especially if you're in that rate rise situation that affects people. But no, I've decided I don't want to own property anymore, so I'm renting. And happy to be there.
Yeah.
But I just believe that for many people, if they could deduct their mortgage interest, not the whole payment, but the interest portion of their mortgage, that would be a useful thing for the economy. But I don't know how that works out in terms of tax rules and all that.
Well, Jesse, thank you very much. And it sounds like that you do worry about people being able to keep up with their mortgages. So thanks so much for the call from Courtney.
And they could do
pardon me, go ahead.
Too.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The government could do that instantly. It's not something that requires a lot of thinking.
Okay, Jesse, thanks so much for the call, okay? Take care.
Yes, thank you.
Cole is up next in Kelowna. Hi, Cole. What do you want to raise?
How's it going?
Good. Thanks so much for calling.
Hey, yeah, I just feel like there's a larger issue here at play, which is when it comes to like just the amount of immigrants and refugees Canada continues to bring in when we don't even have solutions for, you know, people that live in Canada. The housing has just been getting worse and worse and worse over the last couple decades. My mortgage has doubled in the last year, and I just feel like until we can actually be realistic on the amount of people we can bring into our country at a time, this is just going to continue to be an issue.
And for yourself, Cole, you know, what impact have the rising interest rates had on you?
I mean, I'm very fortunate that I have a decent paying job and I'm able to afford the drastic increases. Like I said, my mortgage doubled on a bi-weekly payment. But I can't imagine those families out there with a single income or, you know, that aren't as fortunate in the amount they make, how they can have that. You know, I'm one of those people. I locked in at a variable rate. Sorry, I didn't lock in. I went into a variable rate, but with the expectation that it was going to remain low, like we were all told, well, it didn't. And, you know, I had to make some changes here and there, but it doesn't come down to me going to the food bank like so many people are, right? And I just think when, you know, I understand that we as a country, well, that, like we are, we need to bring in people who are struggling from other places in the world, but I don't think, you know, Toronto's sub-zero right now, and you have thousands of refugees on the streets, and it's like, how are we able to sit here and say that that's a better way of life for anyone, right? When we have our own people who have been struggling for years and years and years, right? So I think until the federal government takes that role on and sorts that problem out, we're just going to continue to see this never-ending issue of lack of housing. And yeah, I think that's more of an issue that they're responsible for than necessarily the housing issue itself.
Cole, thank you so much for the call.
Thanks.
Good to hear from you in Kelowna. Let's put that to Carolina Ibarra. Increasing population, the federal government plans to welcome many more immigrants and refugees into the country. And so how can they ensure that there will be an infrastructure for them? What do you see over at Pacifica Housing?
Yes, it's an interesting situation because we certainly need immigrants and we need to do our part to support refugees. And we've got, they bring so much richness to our country, and we've got labor shortages that they can help support us with in filling jobs. And yet there's also not sufficient housing for us to welcome people appropriately. I know the province has requested that the federal government tie some housing targets to the number of people being welcomed into the country, which is important. We definitely need to do a lot more to be more welcoming to both immigrants and refugees, not just in housing, but also in services for refugees in particular, because it's not easy moving to a new country, especially when you've experienced the trauma of war. So that's a really good point. I don't think it's something that we can slow down or stop, because we do need the people coming into our communities, but we definitely need to prepare better.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And we'll follow up on that question that you had about the homelessness fund as well, and where that might fit into tomorrow's announcement. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Carolina Ibarra is CEO of the Pacifica Housing over on the island. It's 12:52 now, 1:52 in the Mountain Time Zone. Earlier, you heard from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre and his thoughts about what he wants to see in tomorrow's fall fiscal update. Well, for more on this topic, we're joined now by Jenny Kwan. She's the NDP MP for Vancouver East and that party's critic for housing, immigration, refugees, and citizenship. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't I put that question to you? The point that our caller Cole raised in terms of the government continuing to increase numbers of immigration into the country when there is not enough housing.
Well, I think first off, we have to remember where the housing crisis came from. And in fact, the housing crisis came when successive Liberal and Conservative governments refused to invest in housing. It was actually back in 1992 when the Conservatives, with Poilievre as part of the Harper administration, that canceled the National Co-op Housing Program. Subsequent to that, we had the Liberals come into government, and in 1993, they canceled the National Affordable Housing Program. In all, when you have governments stop investing in the development of social housing, in the development of co-op housing, you are creating a housing crisis. As a result of that, Canada lost more than 500,000 units of affordable housing that would otherwise have been built.
Okay,
but in addition to that, we also had a situation whereby the government facilitated wealthy investors and corporate landlords to buy up low-cost rental apartments. And by doing that, we also lost under the Harper administration with Poilievre as part of that administration, Canada lost some 800,000 units of low-cost rental apartments that were renting at $750 a month, another 250,000 under the Liberals. So successive Liberal Conservative governments have helped create the housing crisis. Blaming newcomers, I don't think is the solution. I don't think that's the answer. The reality is this: Canada actually need newcomers to come and support our economy. We needed that during COVID. And in fact, some of the newcomers took on some of the most dangerous jobs and actually got sick during COVID. Some of them actually went home in a body bag.
Okay.
Let's just remember, newcomers are important for Canada's economy.
Okay.
They're not to blame for the housing crisis.
The question is more about increased demand on the limited supply of housing, and you pointed out where you believe that comes from. With regard to tomorrow's fall economic update, how can the Liberal government, supported by the NDP, ensure that the funding goes toward building housing that becomes affordable and not just for investors? What's being done to ensure that actually becomes affordable housing?
Well, what the NDP has always put on the table is one, to say to the government clearly that they need to invest in the development of social housing and co-op housing. So we'll be looking to see whether or not the fall economic statement will realize those measures, because that's absolutely critical. Unlike the Conservatives, unlike Polyev, we do not believe in building social housing, co-op housing is a Soviet style of takeover of housing.
But how do you ensure that, though? How do you ensure that that's what happens?
But we'll see tomorrow whether or not the government is going to announce that in the fall economic statement. One thing that we've called for is further investment into the co-investment fund. That is a program under the National Housing Strategy that has developed social housing and affordable housing for the community. And that fund primarily has been depleted now. And so we need the government to reinvest into the co-investment fund. So that's one measure. The other thing that we've said to the government as well, to encourage the development of housing, both on the nonprofit sector side and even in the for-profit sector side, is to help stabilize the mortgage rates for builders. And so if the government can come in with a program that will ensure mortgage rates are below market in a stabilized way, so that we can ensure that people know what they're anticipating and therefore enter into the market in that development. What is important in that process, of course, is that in giving low interest rates, below market interest rates to potential developers, nonprofit or otherwise, we need to make sure that there's a return back to the community. And that is to say the housing needs to be actually below market in perpetuity of the units.
Okay. So you'll be watching for those kinds of measures. If you're not satisfied, if the party is not satisfied with tomorrow's fiscal update, would there be any change to the confidence and supply agreement with the Liberals?
Well, per usual, we've been working really hard to push the government. I mean, all the measures that we've been able to gain, for example, on the dental care plan, the government did not do that. The Liberals voted against it previously. We were able to force the government to take action. We'll continue to do that work to force the government to take the necessary action to realize these important measures. On the housing piece, in Budget 2022, we were able to force the government to invest $4 billion over 7 years for Indigenous housing, for distinction-based Indigenous housing. Okay. And in Budget 2023, we're able to force the government to invest $4 billion over 7 years for Indigenous housing, Inuit and Métis housing for people living away from their home community. None of this actually came by because the Liberals wanted to do it. It was because the CP forced them to do so.
You'll continue to push. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Jenny Kwan is the NDP MP for Vancouver East and the NDP critic for housing, refugees, and citizenship. And again, we will cover for you live the fall economic update to be presented by Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Michelle Eliot. Have a great afternoon. We'll be back with you tomorrow.